Cushions covered in bright hand-woven fabrics provided extra seating on the hearth and enlivened the sage green and tan color scheme. The door was still open, and Karen and Holly barely settled on the sofa when a cheery voice called, "Hello! Shall I come in?" Nell Bascombe entered the living room, her step lively despite her advanced years and the fact that she'd walked half a mile from her house, which was part way up Arborville's steepest hill. "Roland is just parking," she said. "Is Caralee coming?" "As far as I know," Bettina said. "She told me they're not rehearsing her scenes tonight, and she needs to make lots of progress on the knitting in time for the dress rehearsal." Bettina motioned toward one of the comfy armchairs. "Please," she said, "have a seat, and leave the door open for Roland." But instead of Roland, the next person to step through the door was a woman. Her height and slenderness would have made her striking enough, without the perfectly straight jet-black hair that skimmed her bony shoulders and bisected her high forehead with precision-cut bangs. She wore an austere, long-sleeved black sweater despite the warm mid-September evening. "Am I late?" she asked, looking around. Her voice was deep and musical. "Not at all." Bettina was the only person smiling. Pamela rallied to her friend's side. "Not at all," she echoed, commanding her lips to form a welcoming smile. Pamela herself was tall. She found looking up to meet another woman's gaze an odd experience, but that was the case now. Caralee Lorimer stood uncertainly at the edge of the carpet. "Where would you like me to sit?" she asked. "Anywhere, of course." Bettina waved a hand toward the unoccupied armchair, then toward the hearth. "Pamela, you sit down too, please." "There's room here," Holly spoke up from the sofa. "Room for two more, even." She moved closer to Karen, who had already taken yarn and needles from her knitting bag. Thus it was that Pamela found herself sitting next to Caralee Lorimer, who pulled her knitting from her bag and started in without another word. "And here's Roland." Bettina clasped her hands and gave a welcoming nod as Roland stepped through the door. He scanned the room, then turned and closed the door carefully behind him. "I see I'm the last to arrive," he said. Carrying the briefcase that he used instead of a knitting bag, he threaded his way past the coffee table toward the hearth. "No, no," he said, waving off Bettina's attempt to point him to the remaining armchair. "I'll be fine on a cushion. You take the chair." Pamela reached into her knitting bag and pulled out a partial skein of yarn in a dramatic shade of ruby red and a pair of needles with the beginnings of a sleeve. She'd started the project the previous June, a departure from the conservative design she'd favored in the past. It was to be a sleek, high-necked tunic with cutouts that revealed bare shoulders. The woman at the yarn store had suggested it would be perfect for après-ski, a fashion need Pamela could not foresee having, but she had allowed herself to be talked into the extravagant project. Next to her, Caralee unfurled her project. The yarn was a nondescript shade of gray and bulky, befitting the project's destiny. Caralee's role in A Tale of Two Cities was that of Madame Defarge, married to one of the revolutionaries, a wine shop proprietor, and characterized by her constant knitting. The gray rectangle hanging from her needles was to be her prop. "I like that color," Caralee said with a hesitant smile, nodding toward the skein of ruby red yarn resting between her and Pamela on the sofa. "I didn't get a chance to say anything last time. You were sitting way across the room." "Thank you," Pamela said. "It looks like you're making progress." Caralee's project had indeed grown longer since the previous week, but left to her own devices, she seemed to have forgotten the principles Pamela and Bettina had tried to impart when she first requested their help in preparing for her role. The swath of knitting that dangled from her needles was lumpy and puckered, as if stitches had been dropped and not picked up, and knitting and purling had been interchanged at will. But Pamela supposed Caralee didn't really care, since the point was just to create something that looked realistic from a distance and gain enough skill.